listening to the Labor Notes podcast, our weekly show on rank and file news and organizing tactics. I'm Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm Natasha Lane Yeoman, a staff writer at Labor Notes. If you've followed along these past couple of weeks for our episodes on the Secrets of a Successful Organizer series, welcome back. If you're new, we're so excited that you're discovering the pod. Tell us how you got involved in your union and discovered Labor Notes and our podcast. We want to hear from you. Write to us or send us a voice note at podcast@labornotes.org.
You're catching us on the third and last episode of our Secrets of a Successful Organizer series, which is about one of our most important workshops. This is where we go over the fundamentals of organizing with your fellow union members. We do these workshops online every 3 months or so be sure to check out labornotes.org/events or sign up for our free weekly email newsletter on labornotes.org to get updates. And we also do these at our in-person events too. And if you're sad about this being the third and last episode of our Secrets of a Successful Organizer series, I can tell you that we are going to have, an adjacent episode about how to have a good one-on-one conversation. So look out for that one too.
Also, the actual workshops have so much more information than what we can get into in this pod, so please check those out even if you've already listened. Our Secrets workshops are split into 3 topics: beating apathy, growing your leadership team, and turning an issue into a campaign. We covered the last 2 topics on the last 2 episodes of the pod, and we've linked them in the episode description. So check out those episodes if you haven't already. Today, here to talk about turning an issue into a campaign, we have Labor Notes organizer Sarah Hughes, who leads many of our Secrets trainings, here with us. Hey again, Sarah. Thanks for being here.
Let's do this.
So we spent the past couple of episodes talking about how to assess where our coworkers are in terms of how much they support the union. We talked about identifying and tackling obstacles that keep people from participating. And we got into how to understand the relationships and connections our coworkers already have with each other, and to identify the people on the shop floor who can lead others into action. So now we can put that all together to work when we have to plan a campaign. So where do we start with that?
Some of the high-profile organizing that we've covered recently, I think, contains some strong examples of what we're talking about, which is building a campaign and, in doing so, your union. In January, we published an article from Zach Patton, a longshoreman and labor rep with International Longshore and Warehouse Union Local 23, shout out Tacoma, Washington, about how workers at Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics won their first contract last year. As management dragged negotiations along, the workers did frequent marches on the boss, struck in protest of illegal terminations, including a 4-day unfair labor practice strike over a bargaining committee member's termination. Ultimately, the workers won, quote, 50 to 60% raises, a full-time guarantee, a 95% employer match health care, crazy, 3 weeks vacation after 3 years, and the right to stop work over safety issues, the best standards for vehicle processing workers in the country, end quote. In Secrets, we think about escalation like this as turning up the heat and use a thermometer graphic to think about how cold or hot our actions might be. So I'm curious, where would you guys put the ILWU members' actions?
Well, strikes and work stoppages are often among the hottest of actions workers can take, but there can be variation even there. For instance, the longshore workers' 4-day ULP strike might have been a hotter action for them than an earlier 1-day walkout.
Yeah, and I'm feeling inclined to put their marches on the boss towards the middle of the thermometer, but even that can vary too. Like, I remember for one group of workers I was working with, the first time they did a march on the boss, it was really scary for them. And I remember having one-on-ones the night before, talking people through their fear about speaking up to the boss, but by the end of their campaign, large delegations of workers felt really comfortable just going up to the bosses and confronting them about the problems in the workplace. So even though maybe the actions felt less hot to the workers in terms of joining in later on, I still think they felt very hot to the bosses because more and more people felt emboldened to take part.
Yeah, when we think about things being hotter or colder on the thermometer, we generally think about how risky or confrontational it is, how much it disrupts the workflow, and how many people participate. But it's very workplace and context specific. An action that might be cold at one workplace might be hot at another.
But before we even get into tactics and the thermometer, we have to have a good organizing issue. A lot of folks might think that something like pay might be a good one, since wages are so central to bargaining on economics and people want to keep up with inflation.
Yeah, this is something we want to be really intentional about, especially when we're starting to organize our coworkers around a campaign. Here's what we generally consider as a good organizing issue. It's something that a lot of people experience, a lot of people care about, and helps us build our organizing muscle by bringing people in and training them up to be leaders in the union. Sometimes you'll hear the shorthand deeply and widely felt. The ILWU campaign had great examples of deeply and widely felt issues: low pay, abusive management, and dangerous conditions. But when we're talking about turning an issue into a campaign, we aren't just talking about contract campaigns. We can take on all sorts of workplace issues and win. When we brainstorm good organizing issues in the workshop, people bring up all sorts of things: staffing shortages, automation, excessive productivity quotas, unpaid overtime work, or unfair or retaliatory discipline, grievances that remain unresolved for a long time, management dragging its feet on addressing workplace safety, or something like a change to members' healthcare plans without bargaining with the union when they're supposed to.
And believe it or not, that's just one workplace.
I actually wish that was more of a joke than it is.
And we've covered campaigns about a lot of these things in Labor Notes recently. Quite a few of these were issues in the recent historic nurses' strike in New York City by members of the New York State Nurses Association, who were fighting for safety protocols in emergency rooms to protect them from workplace violence. And they were also fighting for more timely resolution of grievances and being able to hold the company to its promises on staffing ratios. And they highlighted these issues because they were highly motivating to members, and that helped them mobilize around it for rallies and actions, not to mention actually holding the line as they were doing an open-ended strike, which is always a big deal, but especially for nurses who typically do shorter walkouts. But the key here is what matters is that we start with something smaller but still winnable, and we take it from there.
That's a helpful overview of what makes something a good organizing issue. We don't just build campaigns around things people think would be nice to have. It has to be something that really matters to people. I love how the workshop puts it: big enough to matter, small enough to win.
And there's exceptions to all of these. Sometimes you have to pick a fight even if you don't think it's winnable. Sometimes there's still a righteous fight to be had. Sometimes, an issue that might not be widely felt, but is deeply felt by a few people can still build a part of the union. It's not a one size fits all answer, but there's certainly good guidelines. So what was that for you both? The issue that was big enough to matter and small enough to win, for instance?
Yeah, at one place I organized, I think this actually kind of falls into that category where it was like deeply felt by a subset of people, but kind of like widely felt in terms of like the general injustice. But basically, the workers were organizing to clarify a confusing parental leave policy that made a super awkward and inconsistently applied distinction between, quote unquote, primary and quote unquote, secondary parents. And basically, so called secondary parents, usually fathers, got less parental leave than others. And it was an issue, it only impacted a few people, but, a lot of people cared about the fact that that was happening to certain parents. And it was winnable because, in part, like we really caught management on the back foot over a clearly very poorly written policy. And the really cool thing is that it also brought parents at that workplace who often said they weren't able to attend post-work union meetings because of timing constraints into the contract fight and closer to the union. And they ultimately won a standard parental leave policy that applied to everyone, regardless of gender. But even cooler, because they did a campaign around this as an issue, they actually won that parental leave equity before the contract was even implemented.
So, another interesting thing is that sometimes how deeply or widely an issue is felt can change in the course of an organizing campaign. One instance I'm thinking about involved inconsistent discipline, where some workers could get away with a little more than others depending on their relationship with the boss. And I'll be honest, maybe it actually wasn't a great issue in the early stages of our campaign because it impacted people pretty differently, right? Where some were hesitant to mess with a situation that was, going at least okay for them. It was certainly deeply felt, but maybe not widely enough. But as we all began to, organize around other issues and build our collective power, people's relationships to the boss began to change, right? We tabled this, took up other stuff, and over time, the issue took on more resonance because no one wants your stability at work to rest on if some guy likes you or not. And guess what? He likes you less now that you're organizing.
The other piece of this that I think I kind of learned from organizing on the job was that it's really important to think about your audience. The goal of an action isn't just to generally signal collective displeasure with something members are worked up about. It's to escalate a demand that members actually care about and then to actually win something. Winning along the way is part of what builds members' trust and confidence in the union. It builds your muscle, it builds your organizing power. When you win something small, it changes the balance of power at work a little bit and allows you to have more power for the next bigger fight you take on. And so the way we try to do that is through the next step, which is to figure out who to direct the action at, like who the decision makers are who can give us the win we want. And the thing that was really eye-opening for me to realize was that we have to match the action and the target we choose to the power we have built up with our coworkers. And then we keep building power to escalate with bigger actions, bigger demands, and to leaders higher up.
Totally. So that might look like starting by organizing with people on your team over, say, your work quotas, if that's what your team cares about, and doing an action where you take over a regular team meeting as a small group to talk about that issue and making a demand of your team leader. Your next step might be a broader action involving people beyond your team, where you deliver a petition to the floor manager. And you might turn up the heat after that with more marches on the boss. But we want to make sure that each time we do these actions, we move the conversation forward. We keep building up our members. We target decision makers higher up the chain as we build more power. And before you know it, we're well on our way up that campaign mountain.
Quick refresher here that Danielle, our coworker Lisa, and other training team members run an online workshop series on contract campaigns where they talk about the campaign mountain. This is something that we use to visualize building an escalating campaign where we steadily execute bigger and bolder actions while building power with our coworkers, and we match our actions to the power that we have. The campaign mountain includes a foundation, kickoff, escalation, peak of strength, and resolution. We actually just ran a contract campaign workshop series this month, but be on the lookout for another session after the 2026 Labor Notes Conference in June. Or if you're joining us in Chicago in June, we'll be planning to run this one at the conference too.
Escalation is the phase of the campaign where we should really think about inoculation and shoring up members against their fears. We built in a number of exercises around this, including some role plays in this part of the training. Inoculation, where you talk with your coworkers but with the possible downsides of taking action, can seem pretty unintuitive. You're trying to get people fired up, then you're supposed to be like, but what if the boss retaliates or threatens to write us all up? What have been your experiences with it? What sort of inoculation have you had to do, and how did it impact your campaign?
Yeah, I honestly feel like recently a lot of inoculation I've had to do has been like inoculation to actually the boss not responding at all when, workers take actions. I've noticed employers getting pretty good at trying to keep their poker face and act like nothing the workers are doing ever impacts them. So I found it helpful to actually inoculate workers about this and talk about it. Talk about where to look to see if we are actually having an impact. Is management acting differently? Did they suddenly change the policy in a way that's more favorable to us, but said it was like for some reason that had nothing to do with us? And really just preparing people to pay a little less attention to management's words and tones and more attention to their actual actions. Because it can be really demoralizing when workers, you do a big action and it seems like the boss didn't even notice.
At this workplace I talked about earlier, there was a pattern where people who challenged the boss quickly got disciplinary write-ups, or suddenly it would be determined that they had performance issues, even though their actual performance hadn't changed. This was a thing we really had to name and be open about, that talking about the improvements we wanted to see carried some risk, but they couldn't exactly get rid of us all. And besides, nothing was going to get better if we didn't do something about it. Ultimately, while it can seem counterintuitive to bring up things that could go wrong, in my experience, these things are already on people's minds. You're not telling them something they haven't already thought about. But you are deepening that trust with your coworker because they see you're not just going to spin them a rosy picture where everything goes fine right away.
We would really love to hear from you all about your campaigns and how you used any of these strategies in your own workplaces. Email us at podcast@labornotes.org.
That's our episode. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, please download our episode.
And don't miss our next session on what to do when your union breaks your heart on May 5th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Daniel Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.